Narrow cylindrical vases can be quite deceptively difficult to throw, and making sure that the clay is distributed evenly throughout the vessels is almost just as troublesome as reaching one's hand inside these without distorting the entire pot. So, in this video, I'll go over how I throw them, how I trim them, and I'll discuss a multitude of tips and tricks along the way. To begin with, I'm weighing out balls of clay, each of which weighing approximately 400 grams. I don't mind if they're not perfect, as ultimately the whole aim with these pots is to display them in small groups that vary in size slightly. What is important though is to make sure that the clay is thoroughly wedged, as these are such narrow shapes. Any bubbles or inconsistencies in the clay will just be exaggerated so much as I pull the walls up higher and higher. And if these narrow cylinders twist or buckle as I'm throwing them, they can be exceedingly difficult to save, in the same way I might be able to with other pots. So before I begin throwing, each ball of clay is mixed really well. The only additional tools I use for throwing these pots are some extra long sponges on sticks, and a throwing stick too, as obviously once the pot's been thrown, it's almost impossible to reach inside to the bottom to sponge out the water or alter the shape with your hand. So instead, I rely on much longer tools than I usually use. As for throwing these, the beginning starts like any pot does. The lump of clay is firmly thrown into the very centre of the wheel, and then I spend some time thoroughly centering it, which consists of coning it up and down numerous times. Once again, with these narrow cylinders, I'm being much more thorough than I usually might. Once the clay feels nice and even beneath my hands and is spinning without any wobbles in its surface, I'll then add some water to the top and plunge a finger and thumb into the middle to create the internal form of the pot. I don't push all the way through to the metal, instead I leave a thin skim of clay between it that likely measures about 4 to 5 millimeters thick, and then I can begin to pull the clay up. With these cylinders I try to get as much height as possible in the first two pulls. This is because as the pot gets taller and more narrow, it becomes increasingly more difficult to reach your hand all the way into that bottom corner of the pot. So I really dig my knuckle in and create a large bulge above it, which I then slowly pull upwards, keeping my hands steady as I move them with the same position held whilst moving at a very even pace. Then, once my hands reach the top, I just very carefully let them go. I don't thin the rims out too much, and for these forms I actually try and keep them quite substantial, as I'll be able to throw the slightly thicker walls thinner later on, and it also really helps them to maintain their shape as they dry out slowly to leather hard. With this pull in particular, with my fingertip on the outside, I'm trying to pinch out as much weight from that lower section as possible. And I find that using my fingertip on the outside allows me to apply some very consistent and exacting pressure, which helps to get the clay out from the bottom. Throughout this entire process, I'm making sure that both my hands are wet and the pot itself is really well hydrated, as if anything sticks at this point, say your hands to the clay, you're almost guaranteed to destroy the vessel you're throwing. And here I am once again just trying to get that last bit of weight out from the bottom of the walls, and I try not to worry about the fact that I'm distorting the top section of this vessel, as because I have left the clay to be rather thick on the upper section, I'll be able to collar them in back to a straight cylinder without them distorting, hopefully. If at this stage the bulging section was very thinly thrown, it would be exceedingly difficult to collar in nicely. Typically I start from below and carefully work my way upwards, and then I'll go back down to the bottom and I'll just run my hands all the way up just to get the vase into a roughly thrown cylindrical shape. Next, I'll sponge out the water from inside the vessel, being careful not to knock the walls of the pot itself. You don't want water sitting in your pot overnight, as it'll slowly soften and degrade the base and can leave you with a tube as opposed to a pot. Then, using a throwing stick, I'll create a small bulge at the bottom, which I'll carefully throw up, once again just in an attempt to get the last bit of clay out from that lower section. This is quite a tricky procedure, but I've wetted the throwing stick that's inserted inside, and by holding it steady I can push the clay against the wood just to even out the walls that last bit. And now that's done, I'll just use my fingertips to throw the upper portion of the wall, thinning them out and achieving just a touch more height. Naturally, the walls of a pot will want to splay outwards as it follows centrifugal force, so after each pull I make sure to collar the walls back in. And just before I begin the tidying up procedure, I push out the bottom corner with a throwing stick, which I do for this reason. Naturally, with such a tall, narrow cylinder, it's almost inevitable that the lower section of the wall will be just a bit thicker. So once I've thrown the cylinder to the height I like, I'll use the throwing stick, which I put into the pot, and I'll push outwards on the bottom corner, which pushes out the excess clay and makes it available for trimming later on, as opposed to being trapped inside. Doing this does create a slight bulge on the lowest part of the cylinder, but I can easily just scrape it away with an old blunted turning tool before cleaning up the rest of the pot. For this I use a sharp metal straight edge, which I carefully glide up from bottom to top as my left hand braces the vessel and keeps it spinning without it leaning over to one side, which is what it'll naturally want to do. At this stage I want to scrape away as much of the wet slip as I possibly can, as it'll help the pot to dry out more quickly. Next I use the same blunted turning tool just to trim away the top of the rim, to remove the slight undulation that was there. You can equally use a sharp potter's needle to do this, but I find this imparts less force on the rim and it can be a safer option for a pot that's quite tall and delicate. Next I use a chamois leather to soften the rim, and that's the pot finished for the time being. To remove it from the wheel, I take a twisted metal wire and carefully glide it underneath the vase. I then thoroughly dry my hands and clasp them around the pot close to the base. I then twist the wheel and lift it away in one motion. And here's one batch, all thrown to slightly different heights, and I'm just going to space them out so they can dry out more evenly. How you dry narrow cylinders like this is very important. If, say, they dry out too much from one side, you'll find that the vases will actually begin to lean over to the area where the clay has shrunk more. So after I've made a batch of these, I monitor them very carefully. I rotate the pots often, and I make sure they're positioned somewhere where a draft won't catch them, especially overnight. And in this case, although I didn't film it, as it was quite hot in the studio, I wrapped them all up quite tightly with plastic, just so they could dry out very evenly and slowly. But, like I mentioned before, the fact that I leave them with quite a thick rim really does help. And once covered, I'll let them sit like that overnight or for a few days until they're perfectly leather hard and ready to trim. Once they're ready to trim, I attach them back to the wheel by brushing some slip over the base. I then place the vase onto the dry wheel head and tap center it so it's spinning directly in the middle of the wheel, and I'm focusing my attention on centering the rim, not so much the base. I then firmly grip one of my sharp tungsten carbide trimming tools, and starting from the top and working my way to the bottom, I very carefully trim away the outer layer and try to turn through some of those slight undulations that you can see in the lower half of this pot. As I trim, I brace my thumbs together to add stability to my hand that's holding the tool. Otherwise, the only other thing that would be supporting it is my elbow that's tucked into my torso. Then, starting at the bottom, I work my way back up, trimming through the more prominent turning marks, and once again focusing on keeping the blade steady as it goes through those undulating areas. I want the clay to conform to what my tool is telling it to do, rather than letting the clay dictate how the tool moves. And what I mean by that is, if there is a slight undulation, I'll trim straight through it, removing it, as opposed to letting my tool bounce along and be influenced by that undulation, which in most cases would only cause that irregularity to gradually become exaggerated as you work. Typically my mindset when making these is that I'd rather throw them slightly thicker than needs be perhaps. That way I can dry them out more evenly without anything going wrong, and then once leather hard like this, I can just trim them into the perfect shape I want. As it's much easier, I think, to trim a very thin cylinder as it is to throw a wafer-thin one. I'll then use the same straight-edged piece of metal I used at the throwing stage, just to clean up the outer surface. Then, for the rim itself, I'll bevel the inner edge, and then I'll continue to trim it in such a way that the inside form flows out and comes to a much sharper point on the rim. This way the rim of the pot looks far more delicate than the pot actually is. I then use the smooth side of a rubber kidney to compress and roll over the rim, which burnishes the clay and removes any sharp specks of sand that could be present after trimming. To remove the pot from the wheel, as I need to flip it upside down and turn the base, I carve away a bit of clay around the base and then slide the knife's edge beneath it. and then scrape the wheel head clean just so there's no clay left that could possibly embed itself back into the rim. I then place the vase back down onto the wheel, tap center it, and secure it in place with 3 large lumps of soft clay, which I don't push firmly into the vase itself. Rather, I push the clay down and I let the material that squashes into the vase be the clay that holds it in place. And now I can get to work finishing the bottom, which is always quite tricky for these vases, as it really wants to tip over to one side. To prevent it from doing that, I need to apply constant downward pressure, be it with the tips of my fingers or the blade itself. Otherwise there isn't much to do on the bottoms of these. I turn a beveled edge on the outer portion and I trim the base to be nice and flat, before finally burnishing over everything and stamping my maker's mark into the still quite soft clay. The surrounding clay is then removed and that's the pot finished. And usually I dry them upside down initially, as the freshly trimmed bases can be quite soft, and if I did immediately place them onto the wooden wearboard, there's a chance the wood might embed itself into the clay, imprinting its texture slightly. So I let them dry upside down for a while on their firmer rims before flipping them over. They are, though, very satisfying objects to trim, especially with very sharp tools. If you've been watching me for a while now, you'll probably know that trimming is probably the part of the process I enjoy the most. It's the moment I can refine the shape of the pot. It's where I can make sure that lines are straight and edges are sharp, in ways that can't quite be achieved at the throwing stage. For those of you wondering, all the clay that's removed during this process can be reused and recycled and thrown into new pots, and I'll include a link down in the description below that shows how I do that. When I'm throwing these vases, I make sure that the heights and widths of them alter from pot to pot. That way I'm left with a whole variety of shapes to pick and choose from, and I have one shelf in my studio that's slowly accumulating with dozens of them, which means I can play around with them, forming groups, both large and small, from vessels accumulated over the years. The fact that each is different means that trimming these can be quite a slow process. Some might require more trimming than others, but I don't mind, and in fact I really love taking an object which is quite wobbly, like what you can see here, and turning it, through the trimming process, into something that's far more refined and delicate. The drying of these is perhaps the most vital step though, as they're now incredibly thin pots. I need to make sure that I dry them out very evenly, as like I mentioned before, if they dry from one side too much, they will lean over in that direction, which sort of goes against everything I was working for. Now that all the bases have had time to firm up, I'll flip the pots upside down, making sure that I place them onto a clean patch on the wearboard so that no tiny specks of clay embed themselves into the neatly finished bottoms of my pots. And I'll leave them beneath plastic like this for at least a day or so before unwrapping them and letting them dry out more quickly. And here's what they look like once finished, coated in a variety of different crackle glazes, which are coloured by tiny percentages of red iron oxide, which, when reduction fired, turn into the blues and greens you can see here. When more heavily reduced in the kiln, they can fire a bit darker, and others have faint patches of oxidation on them, where they were placed right next to the burners on the bottom layer of my kiln. Variety is what I'm after when making these, as I want to be able to build large, interesting groups of them. Equally, they make exceedingly good kiln fillers, especially the really narrow small vases, which can fill those tiny spots in the kiln, which can be very difficult to put anything else in. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thanks for watching, as always, and I'll see you next time.